Thank you for joining us today. I'm Bruce Goldstein with Farmworker Justice in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the Facebook program series, The State of Farmworkers in the COVID-19 Era. Farmworkers have been designated an essential workforce in an essential sector, but their working and living conditions create grave risks to their health and economic status. These programs raise awareness about the serious challenges farm workers face each and every day during the pandemic. The series highlights impactful work and new ideas being carried out by Farmworker Justice and other organizations that represent and serve farm workers. This is the 16th program in our series. The programs are all available on the Farmworker Justice Facebook page and also on the Farmworker Justice YouTube channel. We have a lot of information about COVID-19 and about farm workers' issues on our website, www.farmworkerjustice.org. So I want to welcome to our program today Representative Judy Chu. Welcome, Congresswoman.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we really appreciate it. So by way of introduction, Congresswoman Judy Chu has been a mayor. She's been a member of the California Assembly, and since 2009, a member of Congress. She represents the 27th District of California, who includes very diverse communities. Congresswoman Judy Chu is on the House Ways and Means over legislation on tax, Social Security, and Medicare. In that committee, she is a member of the subcommittees on health, human resources, worker and family support, and oversight, which includes healthcare reform and crucial safety net programs. She also serves on the House Small Business Committee, which has oversight of the SBA, and she's the chair of the subcommittee on investigations, oversight, and regulations. So again, thank you very much for joining us. You have an extensive background in occupational safety and health protections regarding farm workers. In 2005, as a result of legislation that you sponsored in the California State Assembly, with active support of the United Farm Workers, the state of California adopted a heat stress safety regulation that requires education and training, drinking water, rest breaks, and shade during times of high temperatures in the fields. What caused you to lead the successful effort, and what have been the results of that heat illness safety standard?
Well, I'll never forget the day when I was in the California State Assembly and the United Farm Workers came to me telling me about the story of Asuncion Valdivia. One day, Mr. Valdivia was picking grapes for 10 hours straight in 105-degree temperatures. He fell over unconscious, and instead of calling an ambulance, Giamara Vineyards told his son to drive Mr. Valdivia home. On the way home, the father started foaming at the mouth and died of a heat stroke. So his son had to witness his father die a preventable death, and Mr. Valdivia was only 53 years old. But this was the culmination of 15 years of efforts by farm workers to get protections from California's OSHA, but were rebuffed. And so farm workers said enough is enough. They asked me to carry a bill in the California legislature to require water, shade, and rest periods for farm workers. It was not an easy bill to get through, especially under then Governor Schwarzenegger. So at a critical point, we decided to have a meeting in the sun right in the middle of a farm worker field. We were there in Delano. We sat on upside down buckets in 105-degree temperatures. We had the press there and the Schwarzenegger staff. And you can bet that after an hour of this, they got the message. So the provisions of the bill were indeed put into law, and California became the first state in the country to protect outdoor workers from the elements. Now, since California adopted these measures, Washington and Minnesota have also implemented their own heat protection standard. It's also helped bring attention to the need of a federal OSHA standard so that workers in all states can have heat protections.
Thank you. And Farmworker Justice back in 1987 won a lawsuit against the federal government that resulted in the field sanitation standard issued by OSHA. It's one of the few safety standards that OSHA at the federal level has issued for farm workers. So it requires toilets and hand washing facilities and drinking water in the fields, but it does not address the issue of heat stress in periods of high temperature. So we have been working to try to get this federal standard to follow the California standard. Now, you've been a leader in Congress trying to do just that. You have introduced HR 3668, the Asuncion Valdivia Heat, Illness, and Fatality Prevention Act. What would that bill do if passed, and what do we need to do to win its passage?
Well, this bill would be the first time ever that there will be a federal requirement that workers in high heat environments have paid breaks in cooled spaces, access to water, limitations on how long they can be exposed to heat, shade, as well as training for employers, for their employees on the risk factors that can lead to heat illness, and guidance on the proper procedures for responding to symptoms. Now, all of this should be common sense, but without a federal requirement on employers, more and more workers will die completely preventable deaths. I am so gratified by the incredible support that I've gotten. Congressmember Raul Grijalva, who is chair of the Natural Resources Committee, and Congressmember Bobby Scott, who's chair of the Education and Labor Committee, are co-sponsors, original co-sponsors, and joined me in the introduction of this bill. And in fact, the Education and Labor Committee held a hearing on heat stress back in July 2019, which demonstrated the need for this bill. The next step is to get a markup and a vote in the House. Currently, this bill has 74 co-sponsors, and if we can get the support of more members on the bill, or if the bill gets bipartisan support, we will have a real chance to get it passed.
And we will continue to work with you and the United Farm Workers Union and other organizations to make that happen. In fact, our board of directors of Farm Worker Justice presented Congresswoman Chu with an award in part for her leadership on this very issue. So let's turn to immigration reform. You've been a strong supporter of immigration reform of various kinds in the US Congress, but we'll focus on the farm worker side of things. You're a strong supporter of the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, HR 5038, which actually passed the House of Representatives in December, lo and behold, on a bipartisan vote. And it would do a number of things, but one really important aspect of it is it would give undocumented farm workers and their immediate family members the opportunity to earn immigration status. So tell us about the reasons you're supporting immigration reform and why it's so important to you.
Well, in this country, there has been a terrible history of farm workers being exploited despite the fact that they are essential to this country. And one of the outlawed kinds of consequences have been a lack of ability to have immigration rights. Now, we saw this with Chinese American workers who were here in the 1880s. Actually, Chinese American workers were 90% of the agricultural workers in California in the 1880s. And the scapegoating against them was so severe that at the time they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which deprived further immigration by Chinese people to the United States, and also deprived those Chinese here in the United States of becoming naturalized citizens. And the reason for that was so that they could not vote. And this is despite the fact that the Chinese played such a huge role in transforming the Sacramento Delta swamplands into productive agricultural land. And now, of course, you see the booming California agricultural industry. So that is why when I got to Congress, I did in fact pass the resolution of regret for the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 because Congress had never apologized for it. But that's also why I felt such empathy for farm workers who've been exploited in the recent decades. And farm workers here have been deprived of rights and, of course, have been in terrible fear since so many of them are undocumented of not being able to get any kind of status and of being exploited because they don't have any status. That's why I was so proud to be an original co-sponsor of the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. The reason I was so proud of it is that it created a pathway for temporary agriculture workers in the U.S. to become permanent residents. Because right now, even though immigrant workers contribute so much to the U.S. economy, they cannot benefit from the protection of rights that permanent residents and citizens can. Visa caps and the other limitations that were set decades ago have created a system that no longer makes sense. And now we have 11 to 12 million people that are living in the shadows. So immigration reform is so important. Our country cannot thrive without immigration reform. We can no longer exploit our immigrants and treat them as second-class citizens when they do such important work. And it's so evident today. We have 6 million immigrants who are considered essential workers under COVID-19, even as states and counties are under stay-at-home orders. And farm workers play such a critical role in ensuring that Americans have food on their tables. So these immigrants have to benefit from the rights and privilege that everyone else has, and we cannot recover, I feel, from COVID-19 unless our farm workers also have protections.
Thank you. And that legislation is so important because the lack of documented status that a majority of farm workers are experiencing interferes with every conceivable thing that farm workers and their advocates are trying to do. I want to get more into the COVID-19 agenda, but turning back to the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, I would like to highlight that there is a component about the heat stress issue in that bill because of you.
I was so excited to see it there. It is the first federal bill to have passed in the House that offers any protection against heat illness for workers. So that alone is historic, besides the Farm Worker Workforce Modernization Act being passed in and of itself. But specifically, this bill ensures that employers who hire H-2A workers or temporary agriculture workers maintain a heat stress plan that includes the provisions of water, shade, regular breaks, and appropriate training. That should be the bare minimum. And I'm so pleased that it was indeed included. It will go a long way to have this federal standard. At this point, it doesn't seem as though the Senate will take up the House-passed bill, especially now that the coronavirus pandemic has upended the congressional schedule. However, this bill has set a baseline for heat protection future efforts in agricultural labor and immigration reform. And by including this provision, we actually have 260 members of Congress that are on record voting for a bill that supports heat stress provisions. So we have to use the momentum of this bill to pass strong heat protections for all workers in the United States.
Thank you. And in addition to the fact that so many members of Congress in this supported this bipartisan bill, I should note that the legislation is also a product of very hard-fought negotiations between farm worker advocates, led by the United Farm Workers Union with help from Farm Worker Justice and others, and major agribusiness groups that employ hundreds of thousands of farm workers. So every component of this bill was part of a very hard fought negotiation, including the immigration status, but also the safety and health protections. So it should be a no-brainer that if farmworker advocates and agribusiness leaders can get together and agree on something and say Congress should pass it, really Congress should not have such trouble moving it forward.
It was a truly bipartisan effort, and it's not often that we have so many Democratic and Republican members of Congress standing together to enthusiastically pass a bill, but that indeed happened. And I was at the press conference. There they were along with the farm workers, and it was such a sight to behold.
Yeah, and I was there for that, and I don't often get to chat with people who I have such grave disagreements with on policy issues, but everybody was in a good mood about the ability to come together to do this. It was quite an experience.
Yeah.
So let's turn to the COVID-19 pandemic and the need for protections for the essential workers, as you've mentioned. We've been advocating with other farm groups for accurate information to be delivered to farm workers in languages they understand, access to testing, social distancing and transportation, housing and workplaces, access to healthcare, unemployment compensation for the undocumented, sick leave, and premium pay. We've also been urging Congress and the administration to recognize that protections, financial support, and other initiatives need to reach the undocumented immigrants because they are a majority of the essential workers in agriculture who our governments are saying need to go to work every day. We've also been pressing the administration to require agricultural employers to provide protections when they bring in foreign guest workers who are especially vulnerable. And the administration has gone out of its way to ease access to foreign guest workers for agricultural employers in the US, even though they've curtailed most other immigration processing. They owe it to these workers to prevent them from being exposed to COVID-19 in the crowded transportation, the housing, and the workplaces. So I wanted to ask you, Congresswoman Chu, what have been your priorities to protect the safety, health, and economic status of essential workers during the pandemic?
Well, we cannot reopen our economy unless our workers can be safe and healthy when they go to work every day. And that's why I have signed on to numerous letters and bills to protect workers during COVID-19. And in fact, I'm a co-sponsor of a bill that is led by Congressmember Bobby Scott, the chair of the Education and Labor Committee. It's the COVID-19 Every Worker Protection Act. And it would require OSHA to issue an emergency temporary standard for all workplaces to implement infectious disease control plans to make sure that these workers are kept safe. So the basic elements such as PPE, separation, are things that should be provided. Of course, constant testing should be provided. It makes common sense. Otherwise, our workers are very much endangered. I'm also supportive of the inclusion of the Essential Workers Bill of Rights, which is authored by Congressmember Khanna and Senator Elizabeth Warren. And both these bills are something that I would like to see in this next COVID relief package that should be passed maybe this week or the next week. These principles would ensure that every worker certainly should have access to personal protective equipment, that is PPE, but also they should have paid sick leave and family medical leave. They should have protections for the collective bargaining agreements that they have negotiated. They should have a livable wage. They should have health care security especially if they encounter COVID-19. And they should have workers at the table when they are developing workplace safety protocols. In addition, I support Congress member Jayapal's Paycheck Guarantee Act. This bill would cover 100% of wages for workers earning salaries up to $90,000 to ensure that employers keep workers paid and out of the unemployment lines. And it would keep workers enrolled in employee-sponsored benefits. And the most important part of that, of course, is healthcare, so that the workers would have automatic health care and not even have to access COBRA. The bill would cover essential business expenses like rent so that the businesses don't shutter down completely and can reopen so that the workers can have that steady employment.
Yeah, thank you. All those provisions would be really helpful to farm workers and their family members. Some of this you'd expect employers to just do on their own, but we're in contact with farm worker groups all over the country, and we're hearing that many employers are not doing what's needed. They're not providing personal protective equipment, PPE. They're not enforcing social distancing. Workers are being placed in housing or already live in housing that's very crowded. There's not adequate hand washing facilities in the fields, and workers, besides touching the crops, they touch lots of equipment, the containers for the crops. They often have to be near one another. Many are saying that they're not getting adequate information. So even though there are employers who are trying to follow these CDC guidelines and kind of do the right thing and protect workers, unfortunately, there are many that are not. Many of these things also could have been done and should have been done by the administration through OSHA and through other federal agencies. But Congress needs to step in because it hasn't. But what should the administration be doing right now?
Well, first of all, the administration should be taking the pandemic seriously. Of course, we know that the scientific experts like Dr. Fauci have been very serious and very knowledgeable about what we should do. But I have to say that President Trump and the White House has not been taking this seriously, to the extent that this past Friday, they had another meeting in the White House with 20 members of Congress. None of them wore masks, and they were not keeping to social distancing. So the message that they send from the very top is very destructive to our recovery, but it's been happening this entire time. And because they have this attitude that this pandemic is not all that serious of a problem, there are things that have to be done that are not being done by them. First of all, there should have been extensive testing put in place. They had promised that it would take place. It did not take place. And as a result, the states and the counties have had to step in. But clearly, we cannot reopen this country unless there's access to a test for everybody, where you don't have to go through all these hoops, because you cannot have confidence that you can invite that repairman to your home or that you can go to your workplace unless you know that the people that you will be in contact with do not have COVID-19. And then secondly, we should have a system of contact tracing in place that is nationwide. This means armies of people that would follow up if indeed there is an outbreak somewhere, so that they can see who the contacts are and can contain the spread of the virus, because this is not going to be over immediately. You know, there's going to be some opening up, but there will be outbreaks that will continue certainly till the end of the year until we get a vaccine. And we have to contain those hotspots that will have these infections. The other thing the administration should have been doing is coordinating the distribution of personal protective equipment and ventilators more effectively. Instead, there has been really a lack of coordination, and each state has been taking it upon themselves to procure their own masks, gloves, and sanitation resources. In reality, the administration should have done a nationwide effort that would have provided then the materials at low or no cost to states. Now, because of this competition, the result has been high prices for essential equipment, as well as a lot of bad actors inserting themselves in this process, perpetuating fraud and abuse. So, you know, we need to make sure that those supply chains are there. And I have just been so aggrieved that the administration has not used the Defense Production Act to mandate the production of this equipment. There's been such chaos that in the beginning parts of this pandemic, our country was actually exporting some of the PPE to other countries. But what we should have done right from the beginning was mandate the Defense Production Act so that the ventilators and the personal protective equipment was being produced, because it took, of course, a amount of time for them to be ramped up. And finally, we should be following the administration's own guidelines on when these states should open up. They actually produced these guidelines. I believe it must have been produced by the science experts in their COVID-19 task force, but clearly the states are not following these guidelines in any way whatsoever. They are opening up right now, but they haven't followed any of the criteria that the administration has laid out in any way whatsoever. So I think we are going to see a second wave, especially coming from those states. And there should be a clear message that the states need to take the pandemic seriously.
Thank you. And, you know, we're just really starting to see reports of COVID-19 positive tests and illnesses in farm worker communities. And we're very, very worried that the worst is yet to come for farm workers, because in many places around the country, the work of cultivating and harvesting labor-intensive crops is really just beginning. And so we're very worried that we're about to see many, many more cases, and that unfortunately we're really not prepared for it. A few moments ago, you told us about the legislative goals that you have and the different bills that you've been supporting and what you'd like to see happen. But we all know that not everything is going to get done. So in some upcoming legislation that's kind of expected in the next week or two, what are the highest priorities that seem like they could get done in Congress?
Well, clearly we have to focus on the health and safety foremost. So the testing and contact tracing needs to be in place, and our hospital and healthcare system has to have the resources that it needs to be able to handle the surge that we will see at certain times in various states. We also are making it our mission to make sure that state and local governments get the money that they need, because they've lost huge amounts of revenue. And we know that they've had to step in to take over, since there's been a lack of leadership on the federal level from the White House. But I have a particular thing that is a priority for me, and that is to make sure that immigrants are included in our relief efforts. I just am so pained that immigrants have been left out of all the previous immigration, COVID-19 relief bills. It's not for lack of trying, because Democrats have tried to include this in every single bill, but Republicans have been resistant. And as a result, immigrants could not get the relief rebates that came out. And that is those with an ITIN number, but not a Social Security number, could not get that. And those, what's even worse, the mixed family status situation, where you could have a US citizen in the family, but if anybody else only had ITIN numbers or were undocumented, then that US citizen could not get a rebate relief. So there is so much that is depriving immigrants of being able to recover. That's why I introduced the Coronavirus Immigration Family Protection Act. And this bill would ensure that anybody who files taxes, including those with an ITIN number, would receive an economic impact payment, including the $1,200 payment that happened in the last bill. But also, this bill would halt the implementation of the public charge rule, which terrified so many immigrants, and would ensure that the benefits that are received during the pandemic do not count as a negative factor in future immigration status determinations. The bill would also provide emergency Medicaid services. Right now, of course, our undocumented persons cannot access them, but even those who are legal permanent residents and have been here under 5 years. And it only is essential, if we are to recover from coronavirus, that everybody has access to medical care, especially for the coronavirus. You can't have such large sectors having no access to treatment. Also, of course, we know that many people are suffering as far as being able to eat. And so we would have the disaster SNAP program extended to allow for it to assist everybody in this country. And also, this would provide grants to community-based organizations for the purpose of supporting culturally and linguistically appropriate materials so that people can truly understand the screening, the testing, the treatment, and the public health practices of COVID-19. So I am hopeful that provisions of the Coronavirus Immigration Families Protection Act can be included in this next package, especially this provision that ITIN filers can get their economic impact payments. There are over 4 million of them that have contributed a net $13 billion in this country in taxes. They deserve to get relief.
Thank you. And that is one of the high priorities that a coalition of farm worker organizations has on a letter to Congress that it's sent. Basically, all of the things you've mentioned are in that letter. Before we get to our last question, I'll mention that to our audience that we and other organizations have submitted letters to Congress about the needs of farm workers and what should be done in the way of legislation to address COVID-19. They're available on our resource center at www.farmworkerjustice.org. Want to mention that Farmworker Justice is a nonpartisan organization. We don't support candidates, or we don't oppose candidates, we don't support political parties, but we do work actively on policies and help farmworker organizations have their voices heard. Farmworker Justice provides the services to farmworker organizations around the country at no cost, so we depend on supporters for the money to be able to do this. So people can donate at our website or can mail a check to the address in Washington, D.C. On our website. So for the last question, what should we farm worker advocates and the supporters of farm workers be doing that would be most helpful to achieve these priorities right now to help farm workers during the pandemic?
Well, the Farmworker Modernization Act was so encouraging because we had support from both sides of the aisle. And so it shows that there are members of Congress from both sides of the aisle that have a stake in making sure that farm workers are kept healthy and that they can continue to work. Otherwise, our food supply will go to ruin. So we need to have the voices of farm workers and their families out there so that people in Congress can truly understand what is at stake if we don't make sure that our farm workers are kept healthy and kept working. So I do think that having virtual town halls and engaging farm workers and their families on social media is very, very helpful in organizing and bringing a shared message to people in this country, and also in making sure that our members of Congress and those that are making the policy right now can understand that farm worker relief really has to be included in these packages that are being passed.
Well, thank you very much, Representative Chu, for helping us do just that today by spending time with us for this program. So thanks again very much.
Thank you.